Okay, it is time to begin. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We are excited to welcome yet another KirkpatrickPrice audit expert, Tim Cunningham, to learn more about PCI requirements 3 and 4 and get some of our questions answered surrounding the framework. Just a little bit of background about who we are at KirkpatrickPrice. We are a PCI qualified security assessor and licensed CPA firm, providing assurance services to over 300 clients in more than 40 states, Canada, Asia, and Europe. The firm has over 10 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. Moderating today is Joseph Kirkpatrick, managing partner here at KirkpatrickPrice. He holds the CISA, CGEIT, CRIS, and QSA certifications as a certified specialist in data security, IT governance, and regulatory compliance. He has delivered auditing services and security assessment services for more than 15 years. I also want to remind everyone that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, so please submit those using the Q&A feature, and we will reserve about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation today to answer as many of those as we can. Joseph?
Thanks very much, Sarah, and good being with everyone today. Thank you so much for taking some time to join us today as we learn about PCI data security standards. Just to give you a little background on KirkpatrickPrice, we are a third-party assessor that works primarily in regulatory compliance and information security. So we will audit and assess organizations that are governed by the CFPB or have to comply with PCI, SSA E16, SOC 2, FISMA, ISO 27001, and other standards similar to those. So we want to introduce for you today Tim Cunningham. He is the individual that works for us here at KirkpatrickPrice. He's a PCI QSA. He's a certified information systems security professional, among some other certifications that he has. And we are very pleased to have him with us today to give us some input and ideas about some of these requirements that people struggle with when becoming compliant with the PCI DSS. When we talk about the DSS, it's a data security standard that was jointly developed by the payment card brands such as Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover, Diners Card, and they have jointly put this program together for the purpose of enhancing security across the industry. As we know, cardholder data is under attack, and malicious individuals try to steal it at any opportunity that they possibly can. And the purpose of this standard is to educate the banks and the merchants and the service providers so that there can be broad adoption of these consistent data security measures to reduce our risk and limit these breaches from occurring. The current version of 3.0 became effective as of January 1st of this year, and there's already been a new release published that was published in April. And to me, what's important to note about a release coming out so quickly after the new standard became effective January 1st is that there are so many new threats that we're seeing. There are so many new exploits happening, and version 3.1 was published in order to highlight the vulnerabilities that were discovered in secure sockets layer, which is a widely used protocol that really is no longer considered strong cryptography because of the vulnerability. So they have given a date that people cannot use it as a security control after June 30th of next year. But because of the change and because of the risk, it's definitely something to bring to your attention as you think about the version of PCI that applies to you and applies to your environment. The DSS applies to you whether you are a merchant, accepting cards for payment, if you are a service provider who is performing some type of a service on behalf of a merchant, or if you are any subservice provider of a merchant or another service provider. So anyone who stores, processes, or transmits is is required to follow this DSS. So whether you are a one-employee company who stores, processes, or transmits, or whether you have tens of thousands of employees, the PCI data security standard applies to you. The standard is broken out into 12 subject areas, and our webinar series has been looking at those subject areas as we break them out and try to focus on them one at a time. There are 6 control objectives for those 12 subject areas, and under those control objectives, you have approximately 212 controls. So there's a lot to look at, and that's why we're breaking it out like this in our webinar series so that we can take a few at a time and dive into them a little deeper and help you understand and answer any questions that you might have about the requirements. Here we have a slide that shows you the 6 control objectives and the corresponding PCI requirements that go along with that. You'll notice that we've already covered in our webinar series 1 and 2, and today we're going to talk about 3 and 4, which is under the control objective of protecting cardholder data. Whether you are a merchant, a service provider, or other type of entity that has to comply with the PCI DSS, there are a few different ways that you can attest to being compliant. You can complete a self-assessment questionnaire if you are eligible to use that method based on your volume requirements that do differ between merchants and service providers. Or you can also have a third-party QSA, such as our firm, to come in and do an independent assessment, which results in a report on compliance. So those are the 2 ways to prove. Just yesterday, I had someone send a certificate that a company had generated for them, and the certificate said that this company was PCI compliant. And so I told our client who was reading that you know, that was not a proper method of attesting, that they needed to ask for either the SAQ or the report on compliance, otherwise known as a ROC. This is a contractually driven requirement. You know, when you are in relationship with an issuer or with a merchant and you have to have access to cardholder data, you are contractually bound to comply with the PCI DSS. The exception to that is the state of Nevada, which has passed a state statute that requires businesses in its state to comply with the PCI DSS if they store, process, or transmit cardholder information. One of the things that we're hitting on in each webinar session is the importance of scope, because this is really where your compliance efforts will rise and fall, and it is understanding the scope of your cardholder data environment. Where do the card numbers exist? Where are they stored? What systems process? Which systems transmit? What people are involved? What locations are involved? Determining that scope really determines the extent to which you have to apply these requirements that we're talking about. And too often we see errors in scoping that lead to, you know, not recognizing the need to apply the requirements into an area or another. And so these are some things that we need to consider as a backdrop to our conversation today. When we talk about how we determine the scope, I just want to point out a few things here. We have to consider the people, the processes, and the technologies that store, process, or transmit. Too often, I'm told by a company that we don't store cardholder information, and so therefore the PCI DSS doesn't apply to us. And it may be true that you don't store, but if you take a card and you enter it into a screen or a system or a device, you are transmitting. You might also be processing. And so a lot of times people have a misconception that the lack of storage means you don't have to comply, but you really have to look at what people are involved, what processes are involved, and what technologies are involved in order to determine that. And another thing that's really important that people sometimes miss is that anything that's connected to those people, processes, and technologies are also in scope. So we talked about this quite a bit in our last webinar, and I just wanted to highlight it again there, because understanding your scope is really, really critical so that you know where these controls need to be applied. So what Tim and I are going to be talking about today would be considered Control Objective 2, which is the idea of protecting cardholder data. And the two PCI DSS requirements that fall under that topic are number 3 and number 4, protect stored cardholder data and encrypt the transmission of cardholder data across open public networks. So when we start to get into requirement 3, I'll ask Tim to open us up here on this. This requirement, when we consider the concept of protecting stored cardholder data, what do you think, Tim, is the first thing to consider when you're planning compliance with requirement 3?
I think that an organization's approach to the whole thing should be a top-down sort of management-driven approach. The first thing that I would do when a group was considering getting a PCI compliance or considering engaging a company to do that for them, or find themselves in need of generating a SAC or verifying in some way, is to ask, do we need to have cardholder data in our environment? Do we need to store it? Requirement 3 is all around how you store data. If you don't store data, then much of 3 becomes irrelevant, and you lighten your load and you make your undertaking a lot easier. So the first consideration is, do we need to have that 16-digit number in our system? If we can truncate it in some way and still have it serve the purpose that it's serving for us, whether it's identification of an account or whatever, if we can modify it in some way, and the modification has to be by way of a one-way mechanism. If you're truncating or hashing, it can't be something that you can reverse and somehow re-engineer that 16-digit number from the resulting numbers. So the first thing is, do we need it? Can we serve our customers? Can we do what we do as a business without storing that 16-digit number? If you can, then you make your life a lot easier. So that would be my consideration, is for management to sit down and say, does our process rely on that 16-digit number, or are there other ways to go about this where we don't have to store it? If the answer is yes to the second question, then your life is considerably simplified relative to compliance with requirement 3.
And I know that is a really critical conversation that every business has to have. Do we need this number? Why do we need it? And how long do we need it? I know I've been faced with a lot of scenarios where they say they need it, but then you analyze, why do you need it? And the answer has been, well, we've just always done it this way. This is the way we've always operated. And maybe those processes need to be looked at in order to see if you can get away with not having it, because it would significantly reduce the impact of this requirement here. Because 3.1 is all about only keeping cardholder data for the minimum amount of time. So if you only need it for authorization of a transaction, for example, then you want to only keep it as long as you need it for that authorization. If you're a service provider and you're doing something with that cardholder information over a longer period of time, what is that period? And identifying that retention rate, any legal, regulatory, or other type of requirements like that, outside forces that require you to keep information. But the idea is the smallest amount of time, the better. And when you look here at the requirements, that you have to have processes for secure deletion of data when it's no longer needed, and a quarterly process for identifying and securely deleting stored cardholder data, that exceeds your retention plan. So if you say, you know, we're going to keep this information for a year and then destroy it, well, every quarter you have to look at that, review it, and go through the deleting process. So you have to have a process for that. But I want to throw a question to you, Tim, that I've heard sometimes, and that is, if I am storing cardholder data on my encrypted backup tapes, we've encrypted these tapes, and there is cardholder data on these tapes. You would have to have the de-encryption key to unencrypt this data. The tapes are stored at an off-site location or a bank vault. Do I have to go through the process of removing that data if what's on that tape exceeds my retention period?
Yeah, I think we've addressed that a couple of times in real life situations with clients. The DSS is pretty specific about it. Testing procedure for 3.1.b says the quarterly automatic or manual process is performed for, quote, all locations of cardholder data. The implication that is that backups are included. Any place where it's stored, it has to go away, essentially. So that has been unwelcome news when we've imparted that on some clients, but in addressing it, that is in keeping with the letter of the DSS. And sometimes you have to re-engineer the front end of it and ask yourself, do you need a backup tape that sits around for a year? Maybe you don't, and that's, again, one of those things that you might have done as a function of history, but you might want to discontinue that process if you have to go back and re-engineer that that tape or whatever the backup media is. So the answer is yes, that regardless of where it is, that quarterly process needs to address it. And that quarterly process is the one place where I've seen this requirement pretty well underserved. People say that they do it, and we never question the honesty of our clients, but when we go to test that, when we go to validate it, a lot of times they say it's a manual process, and they've got, hundreds of thousands of records, and it's impossible that you can do that via a manual process. So that's one that somebody may want to look at early on in the process and say, how are we going to do the deletion process? Let's automate it, and let's make it as hands-off as possible, and let's commit it to a calendar and make sure it gets done.
Okay, let's move on to requirement 3.2, where related to this issue, you're only storing sensitive authentication data you're not storing it, you're only using it for authorization, and then you don't store it after authorization. And if you think about the information that is contained on the magnetic stripe on a card, there's what's considered sensitive authentication data, which cannot be stored under any circumstances, but it is data that has to be used for authorization. And so you want to make sure that your systems, your logs are not storing that kind of data, and that it's unrecoverable after authorization. And a lot of times people will use tools to do this. For us, when we're doing assessments, we will use tools that search your systems for this type of data, because sometimes people will think they're not storing this information, but that they are. And so that's one of our jobs as an auditor, is to look for that. And so there are free tools out there, there are commercial tools that will allow you to search your systems for this type of data, and it's definitely good practice to do. And sometimes the obvious location for an organization might be a point of sale machine, or an application server, a database server, but some of the systems that aren't checked as regularly would be a log server or some type of a testing server, some other type of devices like that might end up with sensitive information. So searching for it proactively and looking for where it is so that you can remove it and change your processes so that it doesn't end up there is very, very important. But you are prohibited from storing the verification code that is on the back of the card. If you're looking at a Visa or a MasterCard, Those verification codes cannot be stored ever. For an American Express card, there's a 4-digit code on the front of that card. That's the code that can't be stored. And then on our next slide, the other control with this is you can't store the PIN number, the encrypted PIN block. Unfortunately, we've heard of the breaches that did expose the PINs, and that contributes to very dangerous results, which is hackers are able to take the data that they stole and they can remake cards. You know, they can make the fake cards and they use the PIN number to then go to an ATM machine and make cash withdrawals. And so we can't store the PIN block or the PIN code at all for that reason, so that it doesn't get out. The common question that we get, Tim, that I'd like for you to answer today is a lot of times people look at us on this requirement and they'll say, but don't I have to store the security code if I'm going to do a recurring payment with this customer?
Yeah, I've had that question asked, and I think there's a two-part answer. Number one is you don't really need that CVV in order to get it authorized. You do get an advantageous rate. It's more economically beneficial for a merchant to have that CVV. It gives them a better rate with the processing bank. However, the DSS says we can't keep that after we've gone through the authorization process. So that has to go away, and a lot of times we find it in places that people wouldn't suspect. You mentioned the point-of-sale machines, point-of-sale logs. There was one client that we're in, and they thought that this information was only transactional and was in volatile memory and was going away after the transaction. It was unbeknownst to them being written to a local log. So when we went through and did our data mining, we found thousands of these. I think it might have even been in the millions. And they quickly turned to ash and didn't realize that that was happening. It was quickly remediated and we fixed it, but that's one of the things that you have to look out for, places where you don't anticipate it, where it doesn't appear on your data flow diagram, but it's being written inadvertently. So point-of-sale logs are a place that you might find that. But the answer to the initial question is you don't need the CVV ever, and you cannot store it for recurring transactions. And you can store a value that is a token or an authorization code that represents authorization to do that transaction in a recurring way, a recurring manner, at the rate that you would have paid on the initial transaction, because that CVV information is built into that authorization code.
In requirement 3.3, we talk about this concept of masking the PAN. And the PAN is the 16-digit number. PAN stands for primary account number. And the requirement here is saying when you display the PAN, it needs to be masked. So if you think about using an e-commerce website, when you enter your card number, a lot of times you'll notice that your number, after you enter it, turns to asterisk, so that you no longer can see the 16 numbers, and that's the concept here of masking it. And what they will allow you to display is the first 6 of the number and the last 4. So those middle 6 numbers are the critical numbers that can't be displayed, because the first 6 and the last 4 are sometimes needed for a legitimate business purpose. But when you think about this, Tim, with masking numbers and going through the process of identifying how to mask it and when to mask it, are there any things that people struggle with there that you see out there in our audits?
Interesting question. I think that, and I've had very little pushback relative to that. I had one client who was unable to mask it because the software that they're using didn't do that. It was older software, and we told them you need to fix the software or find a different vendor. But I think that the general awareness of identity theft and the sensitivity of that information, people are used to seeing, as you said, masked numbers when you go into a website, and they feel a great comfort in doing that. we were at a client a while back, and I had old receipts in hard copy from credit card transactions with 16-digit numbers printed on the receipt. And it was, to me, a little bit shocking, but it was kind of a picture of the state-of-the-art 15 years ago. People were doing that, and they were comfortable doing that. But I think the awareness in the general population of the sensitivity of that, and the fact that we're used to seeing that, and we're used to only seeing last four, both as it applies to credit cards and Social Security numbers, since there's a greater awareness of the value of those too. That's one that's been embraced pretty readily, and I think one that everyone understands. It's pretty obvious as to why we're doing it and why that shouldn't fall into hands, even if you've got trusted employees. It's just good practice, and that's what the DSS tells us to do. And that is one that people feel pretty good about adopting and implementing.
In 3.4, we talk about rendering the PAN unreadable. And when you do have a legitimate business need to store the 16-digit number, you have to store it in an unreadable way. And that's anywhere, whether it's on a server's hard drive or a SAN or some type of portable media in your backups and your logs. And there are different ways that you could render the PAN unreadable. You can use hashing. You can use truncation. Like we said, you could just keep the first 6 and last 4 numbers and truncate the rest. You can use index tokens and pads, or you can use strong cryptography. We'll get into key management of cryptography later, but these are the allowed methods for rendering PANs unreadable. Tim, are there any common issues to consider when choosing an encryption methodology or encryption technologies?
Yeah, there's a few different things that come to mind initially. I'm going to refer back to initial consideration number 1. Don't store the full PAN if you don't have to. So before you answer the question, how are we going to encrypt this, ask yourself, do we need it, number 1? And do we need to encrypt it? Can we address it in another manner? Again, I'll be repeating myself, but the truncation or the modification of it in some manner, a one-way hash that is irreversible and cannot be reverse engineered, is probably what I would recommend for somebody as an initial thought. If you can't do that, if you need that whole 16, then we've got to talk about encryption methods. There's a pretty good article. It's published by OWASP, and that is a not-for-profit IT sort of think tank, and it's a primer, and I don't know if I have the name of it in front of me, but it talks about, they call it a cheat sheet, so everything you should know about encryption of credit card numbers if you get to the point in time where you say we have to have the 16 and we have to have encrypted because we're going to comply with the DSS. I'd recommend that OWASP document, and I can get the name of it and publish it someplace. Yeah, it's called their cheat sheet for cryptographic storage. Again, OWASP is a foundation that's been around since, I think, 2001. It's a not-for-profit, and its purpose is just to ensure the ongoing availability of good information and best practices. Some people use that benchmark for application testing, a lot of other things. So it's a known entity. So that OWASP cheat sheet is probably a good place to start. And they say use common algorithms. Don't invent anything on your own. Don't do anything that you don't need to do. Just follow the industry lead is the biggest recommendation on that. Because the encryption algorithms are kind of a moving target, so you have to ensure that you're using an industry current algorithm and key length. For that, you should probably use a method that allows your algorithm and your key implementation to sort of move with the industry. If you're bound to something that's built into an application, it may not have the flexibility for moving forward with the state-of-the-art of encryption algorithms and key lengths. So use something that is independent of your application that allows for you to move with the industry. So if something becomes compromised, like we were talking about earlier, if something like what happened with SSL comes about, and it always does, these old encryption algorithms keep on getting broken, so we move to bigger and better things. So use something that allows you to move with the industry and isn't bound in a way that you can't scale up with an application or something like that.
Okay, good. And as we look at requirement 3.4.1, the DSS specifically points out that if you're going to use disk encryption as a solution, then logical access must be managed separately and independently of native operating system authentication and access control mechanisms. So for people who are using the Windows operating system, if they choose to use the Windows BitLocker disk encryption method, does that qualify as an operating system independent encryption method?
Yeah, that's where my thought process is right now. I've looked at that, and I think that because the credentials are maintained independent of the OS, it's authenticated prior to loading the OS, and it is a separate mechanism. It's got separate credentials. I think that passes the smell test for 3.4.1 for disk encryption using the BitLocker.
All right, excellent. I know we get that question a lot. A lot of people use BitLocker for disk encryption. When you're using encryption, you're going to have keys to encrypt and keys to de-encrypt. And so you have to document and implement procedures to protect keys so that obviously, you know, there's no point in encrypting something if the attacker can also access the key to de-encrypt. And so we're going to have to protect those keys as well. And the first requirement there talks about restricting access to the keys to the fewest number of custodians necessary. So if you're using key management processes to encrypt your data, you're going to want to identify who has access to those keys and make that part of your access controls and internal procedures to make sure that only the necessary people have access to them. And you are going to want to store those keys using one of the procedures that's listed here in these 3 bullets. You'll want to encrypt it with a key encrypting key that is at least as strong as the data encrypting key, and keep it stored separately from the data encrypting key. That's a mistake a lot of people make, is putting the keys in the same place. Within a secure cryptographic device, so sometimes there are devices that are used to perform this type of encrypting, and you would want to have it in a secure cryptographic device, and then you would want to have it as at least 2 full-length key components or key shares in accordance with an industry-accepted method. Tim, I'll just let you opine on key management. Are there any issues that you'd like to bring to everyone's attention there?
It's a big question. That's one that I think even if you've been doing this for a while, you kind of wrestle with it. My initial impulse is probably to encourage people to use an integrated solution, use a host security mechanism of some sort, something that does some of that heavy lifting for you, especially from a vendor that's already addressed PCI DSS and has a canned answer for how their device fulfills that, that helps it from an implementation standpoint, and also from an audit and assessment standpoint. You can leverage the work of the vendor. And it kind of a buy versus build. Do I kind of build my own mechanism for doing this, or do I buy it off the shelf? I always lean towards the buy option. We're kind of in a commoditized environment where there's something you can buy to do anything. And there's hundreds of commercial solutions out there, hardware and software solutions. Some of them are old-fashioned appliances, and some of them are just software solutions that run on a VM. Both of those work pretty well. I think you have to consider your platform. Some of platforms, like some of the SQL database platforms, have mechanisms built into them for encryption and for key management. I think that the decision is going to be based partly on what it is that we're encrypting, where it is, how it's being stored, what mechanism we're using for storing it. And I guess we typically stop short of recommending specific products to avoid any kind of conflict of interest. But I think this applies to the whole webinar. If we've got a client or a potential client that's wrestling with this and needs a product recommendation or some guidance in that area, obviously they can count on us to do some legwork and do some recommendations. Again, we typically present a couple of different solutions that would work for them and ask them to go out and do a cost-benefit analysis of that based on their unique situation.
All right, excellent. Our next slide, just wrapping this idea up, is just storing those keys in the fewest possible locations. I'm going to move on to 3.6, where this key management process has to be fully documented, and you have to have procedures for cryptographic keys, including the following: generating strong keys. So we're as an auditor, we're going to look for written procedures about how you generate strong keys. We're going to look for written procedures on how you have secure key distribution. We're going to look for written procedures on how you have secure key storage. And we also want to see that keys are changed for those keys that have reached the end of their crypto period. And that means after a defined period of time has passed, or after a certain amount of ciphertext has been produced by one particular key. Tim, I just want to ask you to help us define that idea of a crypto period and talk about what is reasonable. What would we be looking for in an audit for that requirement?
That's another one that's a rather big question, and one that we wrestle with quite frequently, and it turns into very long, protracted conversations. As noted there on the slide, the NIST organization and their publication 800.57 is kind of the recognized authority on key management, and especially this idea of a crypto period and all the elements that make that up. They do cite a couple of things just in their little primer as to what you consider when you're establishing a crypto period, the variables that you might include in your analysis, your consideration. They say volume of information encrypted, strength of cryptographic mechanisms, retention period of the data, security function, whether this is a data encrypting key or a key encrypting key, they address both. And for those who are kind of new to the concept, the data encrypting key is that magic number that turns your standard algorithm into a formula that creates a uniquely encrypted number. Once you take the credit card number, you apply this algorithm to it, and you also apply a key to it, and the key is an offset value. So if you are encrypting a number, the result of that encryption is not predictable. That's the magic of the key. So the key is really a piece of information that's got to be protected, because if you have both the algorithm and the key, you've got the ability to decrypt, and you don't want to provide that to anyone. So the key encrypting key takes that magic number and also encrypts it. So they say, you know, what function is this serving? Is it the data encryption key or is it the key encryption key? And they say overall architecture or design of the cryptographic solution, which is kind of general. That doesn't help us a heck of a lot. But I think I would encourage that as independent reading for anybody who is going through this process, is to pull up that NIST 800.57 and read through it. It's a big document. Actually, it's a 3-part document. I would say skim it initially, grab what you need out of it, and use it as a reference document.
The history of cryptography is fascinating to me, and it's been around since the Egyptians, 2000 BC, and has existed in some form since then. And I would recommend anybody to read the book Code Breakers. It's just a fascinating look at how encryption works and what people do to break it. because it really is exactly what we're talking about here. But anyway, moving on to 365, we would also look for documentation that you have procedures for retiring or replacing your keys when you recognize that the integrity of the key has been weakened in some way, when an employee leaves or when there's some type of suspected compromise. 366, if manual clear text cryptographic key management operations are used, these operations must be managed using split knowledge and dual control. I think you mentioned earlier, Tim, didn't you, about using some type of automated method versus manual. You know, is there anything else you want to say about risks when you are using a manual method of managing your keys?
Yeah, and I guess it's just implementation of these two ideas. The DSS mandates it, and again, this is an idea that predates electronic stuff. It goes back to old safes where you had half the combination and two people had to collaborate in order to open the safe or to do something. You might have had a two-part physical key. Same thing is applied in concept to electronic data. But anytime you are using a method where actually writing down that key, you're writing down a series of numbers on a piece of paper or something, in order to protect that process, they're saying split knowledge, that there has to be two or more people that are required, that their knowledge is required to do this thing, to rekey or to, I guess, establish the key that's essential to do this. And there's also got to be a second part. The dual control says not only do you need that split knowledge, but you have to have two people participating in it. So you devise a mechanism where two people have to collaborate physically in order to get that key. So I would say that is a hard thing to do, and there's a lot of concepts, but there's a lot of holes in them. I would try to avoid anything that is done in clear text if you can. If you absolutely have to, then be cautious about how you implement this split knowledge and dual control.
Okay, so that wraps up the 3.6 section where we're looking for a lot of documentation around the processes. And 3.7 is really an extension of that. We want to ensure that your security policies and operational procedures are documented, in use, and known to all affected parties. So one of the things we're supposed to do as an assessor is make a determination if people know the rules. You know, so where do you keep the policies stored? Can people access them? Do they go through training? Do they sign something acknowledging that they understand? Those are the kinds of things that you could expect an assessor to ask to determine whether or not all of these things that you've documented are known to all affected parties. So keep that in mind. We're going to move on to requirement 4 now, which is encrypt the transmission of cardholder data across open public networks. And strong cryptography has to be used, and it gives some examples here in the requirement: TLS, IPsec, SSH, et cetera, to safeguard sensitive cardholder data during transmission over open public networks. So, you know, what does that mean? That means in a browser. That means if we are sending something across a WAN to another location, are we using some type of VPN technology to encrypt those transactions? If we're using end-user messaging techniques, which we'll talk about in a minute. But in this requirement, we just want to make sure that only trusted keys and certificates are accepted. The protocol in use only supports secure versions or configurations, and the encryption strength is appropriate for the encryption methodology in use. And the big thing that we want to highlight today in requirement 4 that has changed with the release of 3.1 is that SSL and early TLS no longer meet the minimum security standards. And this information is still getting out there. People are just becoming aware of this, and it just needs to be known that SSL is no longer considered a method for strong cryptography. Until June 30th of next year, you have to have a remediation plan. So if you're going to go through a PCI audit later this year or early next year and you're still using SSL, the thing that the assessor is going to look for is a written remediation plan about how you plan on replacing SSL in your operations and what your plan is for moving forward. And so that's something that you should be prepared to present. But really, from a risk standpoint, the Poodle vulnerability is what started all this. It's a man-in-the-middle attack, and it was discovered that it was possible to decrypt an SSL encrypted message. So now that that vulnerability is out there, now that people know about it, the sooner you can rid yourself of SSL and early TLS. And when we talk about early TLS, we're talking about TLS that relies on the SSL protocol. But Tim, do you want to talk a little bit more about, from an auditor standpoint, what would you consider TLS and what should our customers be using?
Yeah, there's a pretty good document that the Security Council publishes on that. Again, for those who are interested, probably that would be recommended reading in that area. I think OWASP also has a pretty good primer on that too. It talks about what SSL is, what TLS is, how they're different. The early TSL, as it's defined, the thing that is no longer valid as a security mechanism is the 1.0 version. So that is not recognized as secure anymore. So yeah, I would recommend that people do some reading, understand what it is, how those two are different, and probably just noting that what it is that is considered secure now. That's I think it's a 1.1 and a 1.2 version of the TLS mechanism. And that is, again, across public networks. I want to make a clarification. This is a question that I get a bunch. It's like, does data on the fly internally in my network have to be encrypted? And the answer is no, and I'm not sure why the answer is no. But there's no place in the DSS that it says that the data on the fly within your secure network needs to be encrypted. I guess they don't consider that critical. They do address stored data at rest, and they address this transmission across public networks, the internet, essentially. And you can be, this idea of SSL can impact a couple of different places. It's usually around HTTP, where you've got SSL around that securing it. There's also a version of FTP that relies on SSL. If you're using that, then you're probably not secure for sending batches of data. If you're a debt collector or somebody that gets a big batch of stuff that has credit card numbers in it and you're getting it across the internet via FTP, you probably want to examine what you're using to secure that as well. That may be outdated.
And we're going to move past that. Please, if you have any questions about your issues with SSL or TLS, please let us know, because it is something a lot of people are struggling with. In 411, we talk about the requirement for ensuring wireless networks are transmitting cardholder data or connected to the cardholder data environment. Make sure that those are using industry best practices to implement strong encryption for authentication and transmission. For a lot of retail organizations, you can't get away from using wireless technologies because that's how retail stores are communicating with the merchant approvals with the merchant bank. It's how a lot of retail locations connect. But for any other organizations that might be considering wireless or have wireless in their cardholder data environment, what are some concerns that you would point out, Tim, when it comes to wireless being in scope as part of this CDE?
Good question. Yeah, and most of my experience has been with service providers. We do some merchants, and again, it may be unavoidable. And I note that when you go to Chili's, they've got that pay at the table routine, and I'm always wondering if that device is secure and if they're doing that wireless properly. I assume they are. They're a big company, but big companies do dumb things. If you look at Target and TJ Maxx, and the list goes on. But yeah, I would say for a service provider, if you don't need wireless, if you don't need to push credit card data across it, or you don't need it at all in the CDE, I think I'd go back to my initial mantra that says if you don't need to complicate your life, don't. If you're working in a corporate environment and you've got a guest wireless network, clearly segregate that from the balance of the network and the CDE just to take that out of scope. The real texts tell me there's no such thing as secure wireless, even though the DSS states differently. So my initial thought would be don't do it unless you have to. The DSS allows it, and they're very specific about how you secure it, secure authentication and secure encryption, and they've got specific recommendations or specifications around how you're going to do that. So you can do it. I would recommend not doing it if you can avoid it. And just, I guess, follow the DSS. Again, it's very specific about what you need to do in order to maintain wireless in your organization.
4.2 says never send unprotected PANs by end-user messaging technologies, for example, email, instant messaging, and chat. You know, some things to think about there. You know, I still do see people zipping files and emailing them and then sending the password to unzip it in a separate email. You know, that would not be an acceptable method of doing that. But I would like to point out in a call center environment, this is usually where, because, you know, for other types of businesses, we would just say to someone, just don't do it. You know, just don't use email or instant messaging or chat to do anything at all with cardholder information. But in a call center environment, sometimes this is something that from a customer service standpoint, you know, you are chatting with customers, you are emailing with customers, you are trying to help someone with a transaction or with a payment or whatever the issue is. And so these technologies are in use in these call center environments. And so looking at that process and what your people are trained to do, you clearly would not want to have someone through a chat session send you a PAN, although there are some encrypted solutions available out there for that type of thing. But what I see most people do rather successfully is when it does come time to accept a payment or have someone enter any type of sensitive information, that the call center agent presents a link that then the consumer is able to click on the link and go to a secure site somewhere where that data is entered outside of the end-user messaging technology. So just something to consider there as far as how you might potentially deal with that. And then lastly, in requirement 4.3, this is one of the things that you've seen over and over again in our webinars, and it's that this new version 3.0 of the DSS likes to use this phrase that under each requirement, make sure that your security policies and operational procedures are documented, in use, and known to all affected parties. So any requirement that we're going to talk about through this series is always going to be about how is it documented and how is it communicated to your employees, and an assessor will verify that, will validate that people know and understand that. We've got a few minutes left, and I'm going to ask some of the questions that have come in for us today. There are two in particular that I want to make sure that we cover before we go, Tim. Talking about the scope of your cardholder data environment, it sounds like they've got their servers, their storage servers, their patch management utilities, their workstations on a VLAN, and they have now introduced a phone system on that same VLAN. Are those phones and the corresponding phone system in scope for their PCI cardholder data environment?
Yeah, I mean, according to the DSS, they are. They shouldn't be. In order for that thing to be segmented away from the CVE and be considered out of scope, it's got to have no access. So I think that's a pretty easy one to address. You would just put them on separate VLANs and create an access control list that doesn't allow information between those two. If it's essential that they do communicate with each other, and maybe that's the case, maybe it's a more complex undertaking, but they're definitely in scope now, and everything that applies to other devices in the DSS or in the CVE are going to apply to those voice machines, that might complicate your life unnecessarily. I would say if you can physically disconnect them from each other, that'll be good. If that's not a solution that works, definitely put in a firewall in between the voice network, or worst case, a layer 3 switch with some strong access control rules such that those two don't talk to each other. There's, again, we've got a client-ready document that I'm not sure if it's published anywhere now, but it's available for clients, that talks about scoping in a very detailed manner. So I would say read that and understand that and see how it applies to your environment.
Yeah, when you put a system like that in scope, then the requirements of the data security standard apply, and so now we're talking about monitoring and logging and just all the things that go into that. And it especially when you're talking about a phone system, it can get very difficult then to comply by trying to put all those requirements on it. So that's where it becomes a better option to segment the phones away. Last question we have time for here today is, in a call center environment, do the requirements for strong encryption apply to voice over IP systems where call data is located? So, you know, you might have a call recording, let's say, where the consumer is giving a card number, and it's in a recording on that voice over IP system. Do these encryption requirements apply to that type of setup?
Yeah, they definitely do, and that's a question that we've wrestled with lots of times. There is a method that some places use where they say when they're receiving that PAN information in a voice conversation, that they hit a button that mutes it and eliminates that from the recorded call. We've seen that in place, and we've seen it working, and we've also seen it not working because people don't comply with it. I think it's a pretty weak solution. Encryption definitely applies to that stuff. And I would recommend something akin to what Joseph alluded to earlier, a separate mechanism where when you're going to transfer PAN data, you go some other place entirely. You don't incorporate that into your voice recording, because that's going to, again, complicate your life unnecessarily. The short answer is yes, that PAN numbers in a recorded form coming in via a voice call are definitely in scope.
A follow-up question to that idea is, you know, not where recordings are stored, but the actual transmission of, you know, voice data going back and forth. I would say two things about that. Number one, if we're talking about sending the data somewhere, you know, transporting it over an open public network, yes, the protocols involved in that would have to be encrypted. There would have to be some kind of a security implementation, you know, on how that transmission takes place. But if we're simply talking about the phone call itself, so, you know, I'm taking a call and I'm listening to this consumer give me the card information on the phone call, no, we're not looking for encryption in that situation. So the best way I could illustrate that is, you know, card numbers can't be encrypted when you're using them. You know, when you are giving the number. So if you think about walking into a restaurant, you place your order and you hand the person your card, it's unencrypted at that moment. You know, it's out in the open. You're using it. The worker takes the card and they put it in. And so I think of phone calls as the same way. You know, in that moment where you're receiving the number across the call, you're allowed to do that. That's a legitimate business need to put that number out there. But then it's what do you do with it later? Is there a recording of that? Are you transmitting it somewhere? Are you entering that card somewhere? That's where the encryption requirements come into play. So there's that short moment where a card number is unencrypted and available for everybody just to see and hear that has a legitimate reason to do that. Right. I appreciate the questions today and everybody joining us. If you can back up one slide, Sarah, I'll just remind everybody that our next webinar will be around Objective 3, which is maintaining a vulnerability management program. We will look at requirements 5 and 6 in regard to that, secure development of applications and systems, antivirus, anti-malware, things like that. So we look forward to having you back for that. Be sure to look out for an email inviting you to join, and we greatly appreciate Tim being with us today, giving us some time to give some things to think about as we try to comply with the PCI DSS. Hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thanks.